We're good?
4,
We're starting.
3, 2, 1. Sorry, 3, 2, 1.
All right. So the big topic today, and it is actually a huge topic, is war. Is America at war with Islam?
Is it?
Well, it's the fact that we say it's Islam and not is America at war with Muslims. It's almost there's a bit of a metaphor in it, in the sense of is America at war against poverty, or is America at war against crime? And if we formulate it that way, we're actually saying something negative about whatever America is at war with. So the fact here is not so much that America is going after each and every single Muslim or Muslim country, but the fact that America has been stigmatizing Muslims and Islam as something that's evil, at least a good bunch of them out there.
You know, we have a lot of people commenting on this, and one of the questions that's just come in, most Muslims are genetically inferior with low IQs. That's why they're stupid enough to be so brainwashed by their primitive, barbaric, religious voodoo. God isn't real, and you're an idiot for believing in something so deeply.
It actually takes a very stupid person, of course, to answer a question like that, not just because they're ignorant. It's more importantly because people around the world, notably in the West, have paid the price in millions of lives because of statements like that. You know, in that sense, it's Muslims are the new Jews of the West.
How
Now,
so?
since the Second World War, there has been no religious minority seen so negatively and spoken of with such racism as if there's some genetic deficiency among Muslims, except against Muslims in per se. So there is a sense, for me, there's a bit of a creeping feeling that we are getting to that point of racism against Muslims and against Islam, so much so that it does remind me of the treatment by Westerners against other people, in this case Jews, during Second World War. So are we reaching that point? Of course, I hope not. Of course, I don't think so. It's not that dramatic. But the fact that there are people who ask questions like that tells you the kind of racism we have in the West today.
Well, what about the Muslims in America? Can you compare it to, the civil rights movement, the racism against black people in America? I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of Muslims living in America, if not millions.
Clearly, actually, interestingly, Muslims in America are less than 1% of the population, right? If they're 0.9% of the population. But when you ask Americans, what do you think about Islam? 2/3 of Americans over the age of 45 have unfavorable view of Islam. The older they get, for some odd reason, I don't know if it's senility or whatever, but certainly the older Americans get, the less favorable view they have of Islam. Now get this. When they're asked, those who have the not so favorable view of Islam, if they have ever met or worked with the Muslims, they say no. So actually the racism against or the unfavorable view of Islam does not come out of knowledge of Muslims. It comes out of some sort of a perception they have, either from their politicians or from the media. It must be one or the other, because if they have never met a Muslim, well, that's what we have.
A lot of commenters here seem to be tracing back this so-called conflict between America and Islam to 9/11. Is that really the case? Is that when this started, this whole debate over whether or not America's at war with Islam, so to speak?
Well, some people do have short memories, or some people were born 15 years ago, so there will be 15 years old or something. But clearly, anyone who has a bit of a memory, any student of the Middle East will tell you that in 1980, under President Carter, that's when America started getting really involved in the Muslim world. Now, it did come against the backdrop of a major change. America lost Iran, as if America ever owned Iran, but be that as it may, it lost the Shah of Iran. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan around that time in the 870s, but America decided that it will start using force in the greater Middle East if their vital interests are threatened. From then on, now get this, this is not me, this is one of America's foremost historians, right? Andrew Besevich from Boston College says, or Boston University, he counts 13 wars since 1980 where America was either involved in bombing, occupying, or going after Muslims in the greater
So in the end, which
world.
one of those was the most advantageous for America? Why?
Well, actually, what Andrew Besevich, and I agree with him, and I'm quoting him here because I really see eye to eye with him on this. What's miserable about this whole thing is that since 1980, America has lost more and more in the Muslim world. And even today, as he argues, even if they won against ISIS, which is now seen in America as the gravest ever danger, right, facing America, they will still be losing in the Middle East. So there's something about this war logic. 13 wars on, even when they fought for Muslims as they would done in Bosnia or Kosovo, be that as it may, this logic of force, right? When you think of Muslims, you think of force, you deploy force in the Islamic world in such way for 36 years now, since 1980. That is certainly the cause of the friction and the cause of misunderstanding, not 9/11 per se. 9/11 was a point, and a very important point. Of course, it's a horrible day for all of us, not just for Americans. This was a crime against humanity. It was a crime against Americans. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And that's another thing that apparently many Americans don't understand, that the absolute majority of Muslims have condemned the attacks of 9/11.
We have one commenter here, Sean's asking, or he's actually saying, radical Islam is at war with America. Big difference that America is at war with Islam. If you have the same views as the terrorists of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, then you are an enemy to America. So is there a difference between, what we're asking, is the U.S. at war with Islam or radical Islam? I mean, how do you even characterize?
Well, I'll tell you what, let's take, one of the foremost American political comedian. When he gets uploaded and he gets far more viewers, when he says that Islam is like a mafia, right? I mean, to say things like that, to categorize the religion of 1.5 billion people, right? And not only get away with it, but become even more famous. When a major leading presidential candidate becomes even more popular, when he says we have to shut down and ban Muslims from coming to America until we figure that thing, right? Then there's something more than just radical Islam. There's something now that is stigmatizing an entire religion. That's one. Two, well, guess what? There's a bit of a mutual misconception both ways, or perhaps we should call it mutual understanding of some sort, right? That also in the Arab world, in a poll that was done both in the end of 2011 and also in 2014, found, and it's a big sample of Arabs from 12 Arab countries, that 2/3 of the Arabs think that America and Israel are the greatest threat to the Arab and Muslim world.
Right.
Sorry. Before you do that, and Patrick, I know you're going to jump in, but we're going to remind our viewers and our questionnaires around the world that we are discussing what?
Is America at war with Islam?
And with me is Renee and Patrick. And we're going to carry on. We started with the Republican debate yesterday, which was really a dark moment in American political history. I actually couldn't finish.
What made it dark for you?
I couldn't finish the 2 hours and 18 minutes. I mean, the way they dumped on Islam and the way the correlation between Islam and we have to use force and we have to bomb them and so on and so forth. I mean, that's actually such a nightmare, right? That we thought today maybe this will be a good point of departure for us, although there are many other points such as the president of the United States visiting a mosque, but we're going to get to that a bit later, or many Arabs and Syrians feeling that America has betrayed them in the Muslim world. Of course, we're going to also get to that. Yep. But back to your point.
So we have, like you were saying, a lot of people already sending in their questions and their comments about what we're discussing. But one of them, getting back to the point we were making, one person, I can't find the name here now, but basically the person was saying that so long as America does not have a clear-cut stance on where it stands with Israel and Palestine, there will never be peace in the Middle East.
Well, look, there's certainly, Israel has become a major point of friction between Arab and Muslim world on the one hand and America and the West on the other hand. There's absolutely no doubt about that. America has been backing Israel for 5-6 decades, especially after the 1967 war. And the Muslims and Arabs feel violated in so many ways because America supports Israel that occupies entire Palestine, as well as other Arab territories. So even when the United States tried to play a mediator in the so-called peace process, people felt betrayed that, as one American mediator negotiator said, America was Israel's lawyer. Those sorts of attitudes by the United States supporting Israel and its occupation of Palestine, of course, creates that kinds of resentment among Muslims. So yes, for sure, Israel is one of the point of contentions. Actually, many Americans have argued that if America can put pressure on Israel and resolve the question of Israel-Palestine, it will gain huge support in the Arab and Muslim world.
Do you think that's the case now with Syria being in the condition that it is? I mean, if the question of Palestine is solved, and we have a lot of people asking about America's policy towards Israel and Palestine, then will that still be a kind of key building block for stability in the Middle East?
You know, the way questions of Israel-Palestine is framed and the way the question of Syria is framed are, of course, two different. And just to be very brief, Syria is seen more today as a question of civil war, even though there's a dictator that's responsible for the death of a quarter of its population. But America is not supporting this dictator, right? So Assad killed a lot of his people, is responsible for the death and destruction of his country, but it's Russia that is supporting him, right? America, on the other hand, is supporting Israel that has been occupying Palestine for more than 4 decades. So there's a big question between the two. Now, America has, at least rhetorically, has been stood against Assad, but now more and more Arabs and Muslims feel that Mr. John Kerry and Mr. Obama have betrayed the Syrian opposition that they have long prepped in Syria in order to appease the Russians in Syria. So, you know, now that we are in the midst of the Super Bowl season, right? You're from Texas, right?
I am, yeah.
Who are you for?
No opinion on football.
Broncos.
Well, it seems the American candidates are more decided on that than anything else. But certainly Syria has become the absolute political football, right, between Russia and the United States. In fact, it's the Super Bowl, right? I mean, with, of course, not making the contrast too far, but certainly Syria has become the place where Russia and the United States are competing today. And it seems perhaps Russia is more like the Broncos than the Panthers.
But why is Syria such a hot contender in this war in the Middle East? As Hassan here is saying, America only targets Muslims because they have control of the oil-rich countries that they want. It's all greed.
This is a very important point, and as I was saying in the outset of our discussion, is that the entire thing started under the so-called Carter Doctrine, when in 1980 America said, we will protect our vital interests. I don't know why they think it's theirs, but anyway, we'll protect our vital, meaning oil in the Gulf, in any which way necessary, including the use of force. So there's no doubt that oil has been key to the beginning of this whole thing. But look, oil is not just, geopolitics is not just about oil and natural resources. It's also a question of political influence, prestige, and it's a question of competition between superpowers and domination, hegemony, and so on and so forth. And
as the U.S. trying to remain a superpower?
Well, as I was saying in some other occasion, but it doesn't hurt to repeat, for me, superpowers act like dogs, right? They just want to piss everywhere in order to mark their territory. And that's what we've been seeing from Russia and the United States. I mean, they've been acting like super dogs, not superpowers, just trying to mark their territories. Otherwise, how do you explain the fact that Russia now is bombing Syria, right? Is taking the side of a dictator that has been there and his family for 4 decades repressing the Syrian people. And now it seems the United States is appeasing the Russians and giving up on the Syrian opposition. And Kerry just said in the last issue of the New Yorker that, guess what? We cannot give up on Assad because we cannot give up on the regime because we don't want chaos. So really, America is making a major turnaround, and that is disappointing a lot of people, especially in Syria and around it.
Earlier you mentioned the Republican debate and a lot of the talk that's kind of belligerent about bombing places, particularly in the Middle East. There's a lot of different people here mentioning President Obama's recent visit to a mosque, and a few other people mentioning here, like Bernie Sanders and others, and they're saying basically on this one thing, how big of a difference is there between the Democrats across the spectrum, whether it be Bernie Sanders or Hillary, and Republicans?
Well, look, I mean, just to be fair and clear, a lot of my colleagues now are, quite happy and they're celebrating the fact that Obama visited a mosque 7 years or 8 years into his presidency.
Does it really make a difference?
It's not just a question of making a difference.
Why did he wait till the end?
I mean, it actually makes a bit of a difference for, especially if you are an American Muslim and you have been stigmatized and you have been attacked and you have been harassed.
I don't know, Marwan.
Right?
I don't necessarily agree.
But the fact is that President Bush went to a mosque in the sixth day after 9/11. Right? He didn't wait. Barack Hussein Obama, apparently he was trying to run away from any stigma that the likes of Donald Trump had been putting on him, and actually 1/3 of Republicans still think he's a closet Muslim, right? Has been apparently running away from whatever his father religion is, so much so that for 7 years he would never touch such an issue. The fact that he would go to a mosque and make the statement is of course important. The fact that it comes as a culmination of a year or 2 years of process where he refuses to say radical Islam. He talks about extremism, and he doesn't talk about Muslim terror. He talks about terror and extremism. These are positive things. After watching the Republicans, back to the Republican guys, but after watching the Republicans debate yesterday, even I, who just dying to do some criticism of Obama's presidency, it dwarfs, right, Obama and his escapism from the question of Islam and Islamism when you hear Republicans viciousness, right, towards Islam and this blood fest, right? Every time they come and mention Islam, they have to talk about bombings and the like.
Well, we have Maria here.
Wait a second. We're going to have to remind our viewers around the world once again that we have a Renee that's have this wonderful smile, and we have Patrick that has no smile. You have a wonderful smile. That's good. We're happy, and we're on. Yes, go ahead. What are we talking about?
Listen, you need to let me. We have now gone on to the subject about what happened at the Republican debate.
But what are we talking about?
But we're asking, is the U.S. at war with Islam? And our sub-context with this one is just piggybacking off what you were saying. Maria here says, America is at war with diversity and free thought. Anything outside the conservative Christian bubble lately has been causing as much friction and hatred as Islam. There are two different Americans and they're at war with each other. I'm not sure who is winning, but it depends on where you live in the country.
I think this is a very, very sound... What's the name again?
Her name is Maria.
Maria is a very smart woman. We always get the smarter woman and the not so smart guys here for some reason. But anyway, be that as it may.
I think Patrick has a few.
Be that as it may, I think. Look, let me tell you something. There's more than two Americas. There's a lot of Americas out there, it seems. But there's certainly, as a New York Times columnist mentioned a couple of days ago, there is a bit of a nervous breakdown in America nowadays, and it's especially the white male. I'm not talking about you, Patrick. The white male in America is definitely on the defensive. And clearly much of the racism and much of the nervousness and much of the stigmatization, not only about Muslims, against African Americans, against women, against immigrants, and so on and so forth, is coming from that white male American on the defensive, feeling that they're losing their country, even though we've never seen America more diversified, more pluralistic, more rich with culture and opinion and other opinion, as they say. That's one thing. The other important fault line is between generations. In the generational gap, you'll see that the younger the Americans, the more open they are for the rest of the world. So I'm sure a lot of the people who are watching us are some of those people, because the older, over 45, over 65, I'm sure they're not watching us on Facebook or YouTube. But be that as it may, certainly, apparently, the younger Americans, the brighter are the Americans. And also, when you cut it even through Democratic and Republican Party, there's a better understanding of Islam or better approach towards Islam and towards the other among the Democrats than they are in the Republican parties. Conservatism is not supposed to be about that. Conservatism is also supposed to be about values, about conserving one's values, and values in that sense, in the sense of the American, constitutionalism and so on and so forth. It's supposed to be more about freedom of expression, tolerant towards the other, and so on and so forth.
In God we trust.
Why not? I mean, there's this big misunderstanding or misquote or mistranslation of, for example, God willing, right? Or there's no God but God. Every time they translate that, they say, and as Muslims say, there is no God but Allah. Well, that's not true. The exact translation is there is no God in small g, but God, capital G. Why? Because Muslim Jews and Christians believe in the same God, right? The one God. So the God of Muslims and the God of Christians and the Jews is the same God. So it's, we trust in God. It should be at least as far as the three religions the same. So Americans, in this sense, in this narrow sense of the Abrahamic religion, they should be just as embraced as any others.
A lot of people here are bringing up the issue of Syrian refugees and whether or not the U.S. will actually take, or however many they will in the end up taking. Back in November, somebody mentioned that 31 out of 50 states said that they would oppose resettling Syrian refugees in those states, or at least instruct local authorities to not cooperate with the resettlement program. So we have people here asking, how much does this notion of Islam being at war with the United States being at war with Islam play into this?
Well, certainly, look, I mean, there's clearly the Muslim world is not at war with the United States, and the Muslim world does not have aircraft carriers, and the Muslim world does not deploy missiles around the United States, and it's not occupying Canada and Mexico, right? We all know that. So there is no Muslim world war with the United States. There are a few Muslims, amongst others, who carried horrible acts in the United States. So let's put that to bed. That's one. Two, it's actually phenomenal, Patrick. The fact that the country like Germany would take 1 million immigrants, a lot of them are Syrians, right? And think that's a great thing. And Syrians start calling Angela Merkel, anti-Merkel or whatever, right? And other European countries will open their doors as well, and hundreds of thousands will flow in, and a lot of people will consider that to be an asset to them, a new generation, new blood, and so on and so forth. But in America, they would not take less than a fraction of 1% of the Syrian refugees, even though America is more involved than anyone else in the bombing of Syria, right? For whatever reason. That's one. Two, I think a lot of it is not coming from necessarily a bad place. I mean, Americans are great people. They are good people. I mean, I've lived a good, part of my life in the United States. I've lived.
How many years? How old are you?
I've traveled in most states in the United States, and I can tell you across the board, from east to west and north to south, that an American person is a wonderful person. But there's clearly a certain indoctrination. There's certainly indoctrination, and there's certainly a certain ignorance coming from American media and elite manipulation of the question of Islam for political purposes. So the fact that 31 states will take such a stand, it's simply, as I was stating earlier, and let's remind our viewers around the world of the polls that have been carried in America and why the likes of Donald Trump would want to ban Muslims from coming to America until further notice. It's because 2/3 of Americans over the age of 45 have unfavorable view of Islam, and the more they have unfavorable view of Islam, the more they have never met or worked with a Muslim. So Americans' experience, or Americans' view of Islam and Muslims is not coming out of experience, certainly not personal experience, but it's coming out of media manipulation. And I put a lot of blame here. I mean, it's true, we're in Al Jazeera, and we have done our bit in exposing the better sides of what has been going on really between Islam or the Muslim world and the United States. But I think the American media has played, on the overall, I'm not stereotyping, in the overall, a negative role in conveying what the Muslim world is, really, how rich it is, how pluralistic it is, and how diverse it is.
We've got somebody here who says it's not the world at war. The world is at war with Islam, Singling out the USA is irresponsible behavior.
This is the thing, right? In my
sorry to cut you off, Marwan, but there are so many people who are writing essentially the same thing. Yeah. And if they're not writing that, they're also saying that Muslims are at war with themselves.
I mean, look, there's certainly, we're having questions within the Muslim world, and the Muslims are the victims of that. So, I mean, I can't see why we should accuse, blame, or have this unfavorable view of people who are the victims of these sorts of power manipulations, and to be victims of dictators, in the Muslim world. But be that as it may, look at the last century. I mean, how many times have you seen a Muslim country attacking a non-Muslim country? I mean, a century. I mean, Iran is not deploying in Canada, right? Saudi Arabia is not sending tanks to Mexico. No one is putting intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads towards Russia and the United States and France and England, the nuclear powers. The Muslim world did not divide America in different patches according to their interests, right? They did not get involved, did not colonialize the West. It's not, certainly not over the last 100 years or 200 years. But who colonialized the Muslim world? Who controlled, occupied the Muslim world? Who ran their wars in the Muslim world? Who took over resources in the Muslim world? Well, certainly it was mainly the West, as well as Russia and others who got involved in the Muslim world. So at least in as far as memory allows us, for the last century, Muslims have been the victims of war. As I mentioned earlier, and for our viewers around the world, it's good to remember, as American military historian Andrew Besovich says in very clear words, he lists 13 countries in which the United States, Muslim countries, with which the United States has been at war or bombing or the likes over the last 3-4 decades. So certainly Muslims and Islam has been a victim for over a century of the kind of Western, northern manipulation of their culture, of their people, and the likes. And just one last note about that. People need to remember, we're talking today about ISIS. Maybe it's a good time to move to ISIS. People talk about ISIS, and we just heard yesterday from the Republican debate how ISIS is the gravest danger ever, right? And how Muslims are producing, and Islam produces ISIS. But anyone with not just a bit of memory, but a bit of common sense knows that ISIS is the culmination of, is the result of, amongst other things, but mainly the American occupation of Iraq in 2003, right? Have we heard any apology from any significant American official for the invasion of Iraq? Okay, Iraq is a very important Muslim country. It's a cradle of civilization. You know what a war does to a country? It destroys its culture. It deforms its religion. It destroys its people. It burns its possibility for development. I mean, war is not just something we just say, oh, we got it wrong in 2003. Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. Excuse me? We all knew Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. But the fact that America went in and we have hundreds of thousands of casualties, mostly Muslim, in a Muslim land, in a Muslim region, it requires a bit perhaps of a humility, perhaps of an apology by the West, instead of attacking Islam for ISIS. Well, maybe the United States and the rest of them needs to look a bit inward and see why their geopolitics created ISIS, not Islam.
Or maybe look inwards and fix problems at home before worrying about problems abroad, no?
Where at home?
In America.
Well, I mean, we'll leave that to another day. Another day, another occasion.
So we have somebody here that pointed out that that although Republicans are citing ISIS as the reason so much now, particularly in the most recent debate, which you talked about, that the first few years in Syria there was no ISIS to speak of. How true is that in the extent that, like, I mean, it seems the insinuation is that ISIS is being used as a kind of excuse for this kind of heated rhetoric.
Well, let me tell you something. I mean, my favorite phrase now, and I think it's something that needs to stick in everyone's mind. That's how I see ISIS. ISIS is at your service. It's at America's service. It's at France's service. It's at Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria's service. It's at the dictatorship in Baghdad's service, the sectarian dictatorship of Maliki and later on Ta'abadi. It's at the service of the military-industrial complex that's now creating a huge new industry and exports of arms to the Middle East and elsewhere. It is at the service of every reactionary, including Mr. Putin in Russia. ISIS has given excuse to every weasel around the world to intervene in the Muslim world to clean up their sins from past violations of the Muslim world under the banner of ISIS. ISIS has given excuse to everyone to go after the Muslim world, to go after Islam. And who produced ISIS? ISIS is produced clearly in Iraq and Syria. Everyone knows that, correct? It's not a long history. I mean, it's not centuries.
That's where
It's
they
over
were
the
produced.
last 3 years, right? And we all know that it started in Iraq. You're smiling because you're. But wait, just hold that. It started 2-3 years ago, right? It started notably after the American invasion of Iraq, so that's one. So there is a bit of a Bush war criminal reason for that. And that's the bit of the part of Iraq. Later on, supporting a sectarian government called the Maliki government. Sectarian meaning Shia sectarian against Sunnis that pushed a good number of Sunnis towards ISIS. So that's Iraq. In Syria, we have, allow me for this expression, I will not repeat it again. If you ever ask me, I will say I did not say it. So while Bush was a war criminal that led to the war in Iraq, we have a political criminal called Mr. Obama that promised so much in Syria, that said that the Syrian opposition was the representative of the Syrian people, that said Mr. Assad must go, that saw under his watch the killing of 250,000 Syrians, a genocide in Syria, including the use of chemical weapons against civilians, where he considered it, and the world considered it, a red line, right? All of that happened, and Obama kept on making excuse after excuse why not only he would not intervene, I'm fine with him not intervening militarily, but certainly a good number of countries should have created some kind of safe zone, a safe haven for some of these refugees to run away from the barrel bombs of their dictator Assad. The fact that when the world once upon a time, just a few decades ago, said, never again will we have a genocide in our hand. We had a genocide in Rwanda, we had a genocide in Bosnia, and now we have a genocide in Syria. These are the reasons that the likes of ISIS is coming to the service of those stakeholders who would like to see instability, would like to see violence, would like to see hegemony, intervention, war, and the likes. The Syrian people are innocent of ISIS. The Iraqi people are innocent of ISIS. War, geopolitics leads to ISIS, not religion and not Islam. What one report really struck me and shouldn't have surprised me, but it still shocked me, is when we figured out that most of those people who are now going to join ISIS take along with them Islam for idiots, right? Because they have absolutely no clue about Islam.
You're kidding.
So the fact that they would not have to go, they'd have to take their Islam for beginners, Islam for idiots, in order for them
That
to join
exists.
Islam. Because there's a report on that. On how they all, once they get to whatever airport or whatever bookstore, they always have to pick up, or on the web, Islam for idiots, because they have absolutely no clue about Islam.
Wow.
That's ISIS for you.
What was the-
Anyway, that was a long answer. I have to be excused for that. Shoot.
We got a guy named Bill here who says that Syria now is kind of a modern day Cold War. So how true is this, that this is a place where the United States and its allies are playing out a proxy war with Russia and
Look,
others?
Patrick, it started that way for sure, right? But something happened on September 30th. So for a while there was a bit Cold War. Putin did not like what the United States was doing, and Obama did not like where Putin stood. But on September 30th of last year, Russia decided to intervene militarily in Syria on the side of the dictator. And since then, Russian bombing started. And from then on, it was clear to me that Americans started changing their position, starting appeasing the Russians. That produced a UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And from then on, it's been clear for so many people. I've written that 2-3 weeks ago, but now this week I've been looking more and more American columnists in the likes of Foreign Policy and others admitting that the United States and the West have caved, that America is betraying the Syrian opposition, and that it is siding with Russia. Now, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, of course, justifies that on his logic that we need to work with the Russians in Syria, and there's no escape from that. But the fact is that he would embrace a Russian draft for UN Security Council resolution. The fact that he now embraces Russia's logic that more force, more military intervention against ISIS, siding with the dictator, that will lead to stability. That is falsehood. So there isn't much of a Cold War at this point. I think, as I say once, and I say it again, this is part of my approach to these sort of superpowers. They are like elephants. No, it's not like dogs.
No, it's not dogs.
They are like elephants. You know what happens? You know what happens when elephants fight? The grass gets crushed. But when elephants make love, the grass gets crushed. So whenever we have Soviet-American rivalry, we're all screwed. And whenever they are complicit, we're all screwed, especially in the Muslim world.
You know, I'm actually kind of surprised by some of the people who are sending us comments and questions here. Islam is not a religion of peace. It's a lot of that kind of same sentiment. Islam does not condone peace. Don't eradicate Islam, just pull its teeth out and castrate it.
Okay, so listen, so we have to differentiate two sets of questions. The ones, as I said earlier, the ones that remind me of the Nazi-like propaganda against the Jews around Second World War. The fact that you start degrading people, degrading their religion, and you start thinking that there's a problem with them and their DNA and their beliefs and so on and so forth. And there are the others who are really stemming out of ignorance. Right? I bet you anyone you want who says Islam is not a religion of peace have never read the Quran.
They've never read it.
Or have never read anything about Islam. Because if there's one thing for sure, what we know about the Quran is that unlike other, and I'm not going to name them any particular one, but other religious books, right? The Quran has such a small little percentage of talk of war in it that the absolute majority of the verses in the Quran, with the exception of 100, like something like 6,000, are all about peace.
I mean, the word
And
Islam
living.
itself.
That is not about to have peace with your God.
Yeah.
But more importantly, there are 3 rules for the use of force in Islam. And all 3 of them are only in defense. In defense of one's religion, in defense of oneself, and in defense of the weak. But guess what? That's international law. International law says that force is not to be used, it's not sanctioned except if it's in self-defense. So the fact that Islam or Muslims now are in mode of self-defense in Syria and Iraq and in other places, that doesn't mean that Islam is a religion of war. On the contrary. If anything, and I don't mean that for all Muslims, but certainly throughout history, what we've seen is the Muslim world over the last 14th century. And I can, you know what? Okay, allow me this for a second, okay? Let's take a broad view of history. The last 14th century, since Islam came to exist, who has been the most violent? The Christian world or the Muslim world?
The Christian world.
I mean, look at the last century. Where did we have the First World War and the Second World War? The religious wars of Europe killed 1/3 of Eastern Europe. 30 years wars, 100-year wars. Whatever names that you have for the wars between empires and the war between princes and the war and so on and so forth. But do I call Christianity a war of religion? Of course not. Do I call Christianity a religion of war? Of course not. These are questions of power. These are questions of leaders and politics and interests and so on and so forth. So even if you look at you take this broad view of history and you see that Christian history is full of violence, we don't call Jewish history is full of violence in good old times, but we don't call Judaism a religion of violence. So certainly we shouldn't call Islam a religion of violence because it just stems out of ignorance and a certain Islamophobia, right? In the United States and other places, it also stems from the fact that some people just don't want to take responsibility for their political and geopolitical failures, mistakes, and aggression against the Muslim world. So they blame Islam for that. That's why I ask nowadays, is the war on terror a war on Islam? Because that's more and more where we're going.
It seems.
We have one person here that says the question is not about whether or not Islam is at war with the United States or the West, but you can look to Syria or Iraq, for example, and see that Muslims are at war with Christians from those societies, Syrian Christians or Iraqi Christians.
Absolutely not. I mean, if you actually look carefully, that's the problem with the role of the media, how it manipulates and how it's also sometimes so superficial and so on and so forth. The question is today for example, Christianity in the Middle East. It's not Muslims. It's dictatorship, wars, occupation, dispossession, repression, and so on and so forth. It's the fact that we do have new creatures out of war and occupation like ISIS that just does that. But this part of the world, Patrick, for centuries now, has had coexistence between Christians and Muslims and other faiths. I mean, we haven't had that for centuries. Look, even under the Ottoman Empire, right? That lasted for 400 years. That was a Muslim empire of sort, right? I mean, we've seen less friction and less war and violence among religion than in Europe, for example. Even Europe of the Enlightenment, even Europe after the French Revolution. We've seen far more friction among Protestants and Catholics than we've ever seen among Shiites and Sunnis, or again between Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the East. If anything, the Middle East has been, and the Muslim world in general, have been a cradle of civilization. It brought in other religions and it coexisted from Andalusia to Baghdad. Now, do we have something a bit absurd and bad and so on and so forth the last several decades? Of course. Does that touch minorities? Yes. But is it a result of Islam or Muslims? Absolutely not. It's a result of war and repressions and dictatorships. And by the way, I think we're around 45 minutes into our thing, and we're probably going to have to wrap it up. But here, I'm going to give you the last question.
I like this one here. It says, America isn't at war with Islam. I'm American and Muslim. Maybe some government officials think we are, but most Americans are beautifully accepting of Islam.
Well, I certainly agree with that to some extent, but not a lot, because I was just quoting why the likes of Donald Trump will say something so racist, such as we have to ban Muslims until further notice from entering the United States. It's because a good number of Americans, especially those over 45 years of age, think unfavorably of Muslims. Fortunately, a lot of them think unfavorable Muslims, even though they've never met or worked with a Muslim. So it's actually coming from indoctrination or coming from media misperception of Islam and the fact that America is at war in the Islamic world. Now, I think it's good that some people like that, and it's good to end on a positive note, that I think Muslim Americans will always be an engine of positive and an engine of coexistence among Americans. I mean, in the end of the day, the Muslim Americans I've met and I've known and that I've studied certainly are a plus for the United States, but they will simply add yet another layer to a wonderful pluralistic society that is unfortunately manipulated by the certain elites. And listening to and watching this nauseating debate yesterday in the Republican Party.
You're not going to let it go.
I'm not going to let it go, because that's the kind of thing that gives me the creeps and gives, I think, a lot of Americans the creeps, but I think we'll probably be done with them, and I'm sure they will lose. Having said that, we're going to wrap it, and until next time, we'll probably carry some more of it next time. Patrick, Renee, and all the rest of you, of course, out there, thank you, and thank me.
Thank you,
Until
Marwan.
next time. All right.
We're off.
Nice.
Thanks, everybody.
Very nice.
We had
That's sustained.
on average about 1,000 more concurrents than last time.
The biggest
This
one.
was our biggest.